Hi guys, to start with, we're going to go over some of the basics in Photoshop. So when you open up Photoshop, you're going to be greeted with this screen, and here you're going to be able to open and create new documents, and you can find them over here on the left. And you'll also be able to use File New or File Open up here, and you can also see the shortcuts Control N and Control O up here as well. So if you wanted to open a document, for example, we can go to Open, and we can select this bedroom, and we can select whatever image you'd like to open and hit open. And then you're going to go into Photoshop's interface. If you wanted to create a new document, you can go to File, New. And Photoshop comes with a lot of presets. So if you wanted print and A4, for example, you could select that here, and it's going to have everything set up to the correct resolution and height and width. And you can also go in and change that if you wanted here, and you can change the orientation as well. So if we hit create, we're going to see that this creates a new document. And if you did want to rotate that document after you've created it, you could go to image rotation, and rotate it 90 degrees clockwise. And up here we have the main menu, which is a way of accessing the variety of functions available in Photoshop. We have file with new, open and save as well as like export and a lot of other useful tools. So feel free to kind of explore this main menu. On the left, we have the tools, and this is essentially your toolbox, and you'll be able to find the name of each tool just by hovering over it and a quick description of what they do. And you'll also see that we have in brackets the keyboard shortcut. So if we want to move to the move tool, I can press B on the keyboard, and we are now using that tool. So very handy to learn the shortcuts, and I recommend knowing the shortcuts to some of your most commonly used tools. You also see that some of these tools have small arrows in the bottom right, and if you click and hold on them, you'll see more tools available. So for instance, this is the brush tool, and if we click and hold, we can actually access the pencil tool by holding down on that tool. Up on the main toolbar, we also have windows, and this allows us to turn on and off palettes over on the right. So we can see that I've just turned off properties, and I can turn it back on there. If you ever want to expand a palette, you can click the arrows or bring them back in, and same with this on the right. We can see we've got the color and swatches over here, and this is where we can select colors. And you can see that it's updating over here, and this is the color of our brush. I generally use the palette by clicking on the coloring toolbar and then selecting it over here. So I don't actually use this very much. So to save space, I do like to unclutter the UI. So what you can do is actually pull these off and close them down. And I don't really use the properties enough to warrant them being there. And we can see that this is now floating. We can just hover it on the right, and we just have our layers. If we need any other windows, we can add them, but I generally use our toolbar and our layers. Control Z will undo, and Control Shift Z will redo. And if you want to zoom in on an image, you can use Control plus and Control minus. You can also hold the Z key and click and drag left and right. This is quite useful, but I don't really use it that much. I find it a little bit tough to use. And then Control 0 on the keyboard will fill the screen. So I use that quite a lot. So really to navigate, I'm using Control plus and minus and Control 0. There is a zoom tool down here that you can use and click and drag as well. And you can also type in at the bottom. So this really shows there's multiple ways of doing things in Photoshop. And so don't worry about what every single button does. You'll find what you're most comfortable with. So when you are zoomed in and you want to pan around, you can hold spacebar and you'll see this hand appear, and then you can pan around the image. So in Photoshop, we will be manipulating images, and it's incredibly useful that we can undo things. And you may laugh, but being able to undo changes to my work was one of the major things that got me into computer graphics. So before Photoshop, I was doing everything by hand, and there was very little way to undo a change I made to an image without using an eraser or painting over it. So to demonstrate this, let's take a look at our history. I'm going to jump over to the image we opened earlier, and in Windows, I'm going to open up history. And let's dock it over on the right. And if I start making some changes, if I paint over this, you'll see that it's listed in the history. And I can always jump back in history to certain points. So we've opened up the image, so we're jumping back to the original. And as I said before, we can use Control-Shift-Z to redo and Control-Z to undo. So this history panel can be really useful if you want to jump back multiple steps. Finally, saving your image. You normally want to save 2 versions of your image. You'll start adding layers and making changes to your original image, and you want to save that as a Photoshop file. So if you go to File, Save As, the default file format is PSD, which is a Photoshop file, and that's going to contain all the changes, and you'll be able to open this up and continue from where you left off. So you'll want to save a PSD version of your image, and you'll also want to save a JPEG image, and the JPEG can be used for web, print. You can send it to your clients, and that's just a flat image. So make sure you save a PSD and an image file, normally a JPEG. And I also recommend just hitting Control-S frequently when you're using Photoshop, and that will just save your image regularly. And a quick note on shortcuts. If you're doing something over and over, then learn the shortcuts. It's going to save you so much time, and even if it's just a few seconds, that's going to get compounded over the years ahead. And I remember watching a professional when I was a student, and it was as though they were playing music on a keyboard, and the way that they were just moving so quickly through Photoshop was really impressive. So a few shortcuts I use a lot is V to access the Move tool, and Control-T, which is to get into the free transform tool. So for example, V will get you to the Move tool, B will get you to the Brush tool, and G will get you to the Paint Bucket tool. And I'm going to show you examples of shortcuts as we move through this course. But as I said, if you're frequently using a tool, learn how to get there through the keyboard shortcut. Now let's talk about image sizes. When you're working with a client, you're going to want to make sure you deliver the best quality image you can. And in general, I will render out an image at 5,000 pixels wide, and 3,000 pixels or lower are enough for preview images. So when people refer to images that are 5,000 pixels wide, they mean that the widest edge has 5,000 pixels in it. So I'm going to use Control Plus, and I'm going to zoom in really far. And we can see now that this image is made up of pixels, and we have 5,000 of these pixels in the image. And if I press Control R, that's going to open up our rulers, and we can see that each pixel is shown on here. If I right click, I can change that to pixels if you haven't got pixels selected. But if I go all the way to the left, we're going to see that this is pixel 1, and that there's 5,000 and there's 5,000 of them that go from left to right. So something at 5,000 pixels can be good for print, but if you want to upload it to the web, it's going to be too big. It's going to slow down the loading times of the website. But if you try to make an image bigger, then you're going to start losing quality. And if you ever make an image smaller, make sure you don't save over the original. So use the Save As function. You can always see your image size down here by clicking on this information tab and holding, and we can see that it's 5,000 pixels by 3,000. You can also go up to image and image size, and you'll see the pixels here. You can change this to pixels or inches for whatever you're using. So if I want to change this width to 1,000, I can do that here. And this button means that the proportions are constrained. So if I took them off and I change this to 2,000, we're going to see the image has stretched. Most of the time, I'd say we need to constrain them proportions. So I'm going to make that 1000 and I can click OK, and it's going to resize our image. And we can see the image size has changed massively. If I zoom back in, this is now 100% and what it's going to be displayed as. So if I wanted to save it, I'd save as a JPEG, and I'm just going to add web on the end. And all of these defaults are fine. So now I'm going to open up our original document again. So I'm going to go File, Open up the bedroom. So this is the 5000 pixel version. And let's talk about images for print. And because we're working on a computer, we work in pixels rather than a size. But if you wanted to send an image to print, you're going to need to start thinking about the image in inches, as we don't have pixels in the real world. So again, if we go to image and image size, we can change our unit to inches. But we can also see down here that our resolution is 72 pixels. So that means that for every inch in real life, there's going to be 72 pixels. So the pixels that we looked at earlier. So if we jump back to pixels, and I'm just going to open up a calculator. So if our image is 5000 pixels and the resolution is 72 pixels per inch, if we divide that by 72, we're going to see that that is going to be 69.4 inches. And we can see that here. Now, most printers print at 300 pixels per inch. So we're going to want to change our pixel resolution to 300. So if I change this to 300, first I'm going to change this to pixels, and we change our resolution to 300, we're going to see that that's going to scale our image up massively, and we don't actually want it to resample. So I'm going to turn off resampling, and let's move this back to inches. So now we can see that our image is 16 inches wide. So if I hit OK, in real life, this is going to print just over 16 inches at 300 pixels per inch. So if I zoom into 100%, this is how big in real life. This is how big in real life this image can print at 300 pixels wide, at 300 pixels rather than 72. So again, we can save this, and we can save this as print. So if you are working for print, then it's good practice to select an option from the print preset in Photoshop. So we can go to File, New, and if we choose again A4, say we're going to print on A4 and it's going to be landscape, I can actually click and drag with this layer selected into here. So we can see that this is easily going to print at A4 about this size. So the reason that we can check our images against the defaults is that these are all set up with the correct resolution and size. And once we've made this 300 dpi, we can see how it's going to look at that size. So you've got no problem printing this image at A4. Just on moving documents, if I click and drag and drop this into our new document, you see it lands kind of wherever my cursor lands. Whereas if I hold Shift and click and drag, it's going to land in the same position. And we also have something called snap. So when snap's on, we'll see that we can actually snap it to the document bounds. You see the pink lines. So that's really useful. And that's just something to be aware of. Having it on can really help with aligning images. Now let's talk about layers. Layers are really what make Photoshop so powerful. And they're very much like the modifier stack in a program like 3ds Max, for example. And you can think of them as layering up a collage and gluing images on top of each other. I'm just going to drag in another image on top to demonstrate layers. And we can see that we have 2 layers in our layer stack. Now layers are useful because if I wanted to erase something from this layer, for example, I could select the eraser tool and erase it, and we could see the layer underneath. And if these were one object and I wanted to erase part of this image, you'll see that we erase both of them. So you can create a new layer by clicking down here on New Layer, or you can hit Control-Shift-N on the keyboard. And you can move layers around by just clicking and dragging them up and above the other layers or below them, and you'll see that blue line appear. You can make layers visible by turning them on and off with this eye tool, and if you hold Alt and click it, it's going to only show that layer. Hit Alt again and click it, it will show all layers again. You can name layers by just double clicking the word and hitting enter, and you can also change the color of a layer by right clicking on it, and this can be useful if you're collaborating in a team and just to keep layers organized. When you're working in Photoshop, you normally work on just one layer at a time. So if I wanted to move this image, I have this layer selected. I'm just going to draw on this layer. So layer 1 has the red dot. So let's call this red dot. And with the move tool, I can now move this independently. And if I wanted to move it underneath detailed naming, you can see it's underneath. And if I wanted to move detailed naming layer, to select it, I can hold Control and click it in the viewport, and it's selected detailed naming. And again, I can click red dot. Just be aware that if this is on top and I'm trying to select underneath, I need to click somewhere where it doesn't have any overlaying layers. So if I hold Control and I select red dot, I could actually turn off that layer and then Control and select. Now there is another way you can have auto select on, but I just find it quite hard to know what I'm selecting and moving. So I just generally use the Control select layer. We also have opacity up here, so we can change how visible a layer is. And you can also duplicate a layer by dragging it onto new layer, or you can press Control J. And another thing to know is by default, whatever image is in the background is going to be locked, so we can't actually move that around. And if you did want to move it around, you can just double click on it to unlock it, and then we could actually pull that in front of the other layers. So we have spoke about resizing a document, but how do we resize an image or a layer rather than the whole document? To do this, we can select our layer. I just held Control and select our detail naming copy 2 there, and I'm going to press Control T, and what that does is open up the free transform tool. You can also find that under edit and free transform, and that is going to give us some anchor points. So now if I click and drag, we can resize our image, and if I hold shift, it's currently constrained. If I hold shift, it's going to unconstrain it. So if you did want to move it around, it's going to warp a little bit, so you should probably keep it constrained. You can also hold Control and move that independently if you wanted to change the perspective of an image. And that being said, you can right click in the free transform and you can select perspective, for example, and you'll be able to click and drag like that. And you'll also find some other cool tools such as warp if you wanted to warp that image around as well. And then you just hit enter to get out of the free transform tool. When you bring an image in, you'll see that it has this small thumbnail on the layer. And what that means is that it's a smart object. And this means it's linking to the original file source. But this only allows you to perform non-destructive tasks on the image. And to enable full editing, you need to rasterize that image. So I can change the size of it, but I can't paint on that layer. You can see there's a smart object and it must be rasterized. So you could hit OK here and that would rasterize it, or you could right click and rasterize the layer, and now I can paint onto this layer. Now let's take a look at how we can edit our images, and I've rendered this image straight out of V-Ray, so you'll be able to find this in the resources. And I'm going to encourage you to use adjustment layers where possible, and this is a non-destructive workflow, and this is what makes Photoshop so powerful. The non-destructive workflow means that you can change and update images without changing the original image. So for example, if we wanted to change the brightness and contrast on this image, we could go to Image, Adjustments, Brightness and Contrast, and we could bring the brightness down and add some contrast and hit OK. And then we'd save this out, send it to our client, and our client comes back and says, oh, can you move the bed over? So we re-render our image and we bring in the updated image, and we've moved the bed. So now we need to remember what we did. So we did the brightness and contrast. I can't remember exactly what we did, but we did something like this. So what we're doing is updating the original image, which is not efficient. So a good way to approach this is to use adjustment layers, which can be found down here. And if we select brightness and contrast from here, and we make our changes, we can see that it's created its own layer with those adjustments on it. So now if the client wants to make changes and we have to bring in an updated version, all we need to do is move our layer on top. And this is really useful for when you're working on a live project. And another good use of this is moving over adjustment layers to other views in a scene. So what this means is we can move all of the adjustments we made on this view to another view in the same room to keep the consistency across all of the images. So I'm just going to delete some of these layers. I was just pressing delete on the keyboard there. So now let's take a look at some of these adjustment layers. As soon as I bring an image into Photoshop, my go-to is always a levels adjustment. So I'm going to open up levels here, and you can see on this graph, this shows the range of pixels. So these on the left are the black pixels, and if we turn that up, we can see that we're getting more blacks, and on the right are the white pixels. So if we jump over into our detail image, it'll be more effective because I've got a lot of white here. But what you want to do is try and keep all of your pixels within the image. So you can see we've kind of got empty pixels here. So we can bring the whites to about here. And the more you play with the levels, the more you'll be able to just look at it and know how you want your image to look. We can also move the middle slider to make an image brighter or darker. But the idea here is to have a full range of pixels within our image, and you can consider these sliders as our image edges. So you can close these properties, and if you ever need to jump back into them, you can just double click and it will open up the properties window. Now vibrance is something that I prefer to the hue and saturation. I see a lot of people just pumping up saturations of images, but I actually prefer to use vibrance, as I just feel it's a more subtle effect. So if we added like 50 on the saturation there versus 50 on the vibrance, it's just a more subtle effect, and I prefer using vibrance, so I'd recommend that to saturation. And next up, let's take a look at curves. And this is very similar to levels, where we've got the sliders on the left and right, but this time, rather than using the sliders, we can actually use a curve to make the adjustments to the pixels. So again, we can make the image darker on the left here, and we can actually make it brighter on the right. And this S curve is a pretty good go-to to add some contrast to your images. And now finally, let's use a color balance. And we can add or remove colors using this color balance adjustment layer. And if we want to make an image cooler, then we can add more blue and cyan. And if we wanted to make it warmer, then we could add more yellows and reds. And generally, the human eye finds warmer images more appealing. And one of the last things I want to show you is that we can actually apply these adjustment layers to only certain layers. So if I bring over our detail image, drop that on, put it this side, we can see that all these adjustment layers are affecting everything underneath. So by default, the adjustment layers affect all layers below it. And if you only wanted to apply it to a certain layer, so if I want to apply something to this detail shot, let's add something that we can really see, like a black and white filter. We can see that this is applied to the whole image. But if I click this button here, this is going to only affect the layer below it. You can also hold Alt and click in between the layers to turn that on and off. And you can also stack these on top of each other. So I could pull this curve up, holding Alt, and it's only going to affect layer 1. They don't have to affect all layers below it. And if you did want it to only affect certain layers, you can use this tool here. Another great feature of using layers in Photoshop is what we call masks, and this can be thought of as a more advanced way to erase part of an image or an adjustment layer. So traditionally we would use an eraser to remove a section of an image we didn't want, but this is destructive as you're going to be deleting part of the original image. So if I select our detail image that we have on top and I go to our eraser and I want to delete this bottom section, we can see I can rub it out and then it's gone for good. It's completely deleted from our layer. And I'm just going to undo that with Control Z. And a better way to do this would be to use a layer mask. So I can apply that down here with that layer selected. And now I've got black and white in our palette, and I'm going to use a brush tool and I'm going to paint out the area I don't want. And what's powerful about this is now if I select white, so I can switch them here, I can press X on the keyboard to switch between black and white, and I can hit D on the keyboard to make sure that these are black and white if you ever have color in there. So if I change that to white and paint it back in, it comes back. And black, I can delete it. So with X and the brush tool, I can quickly flick between these two colors and add and remove sections of our image. Another thing to note is if we click on our palette and add a gray, then it's going to add kind of like a 50% opacity. So you can consider black and white the opacity, black being 0 and white being 100. So you'll see if I press D, that's going to go back to black and white, and I can paint this back in. With our layer selected, you can also, and you can see that's selecting the image, that's selecting our layer mask. If I press Control I, it actually inverts our selection. So I'll press Control I again, and that's inverting our layer mask, and you can see what that's doing. You can also delete a layer mask by just right clicking and clicking delete. So another reason that I like using adjustment layers and masks is that we can use the masks on adjustment layers just to mask certain areas. For example, we've got our black and white filter on our detail shot, and if I add, these already have layer masks on, as you can see, so I've selected that and I can paint black, and that means the color is coming back where we are painting it back in. Probably not the best example because it's quite a dull image, so let's go to our vibrance on our main image. I'm just going to turn it up so you can really see what's going on, and then if I select our layer mask and start painting black, I can actually paint out areas that I don't want the saturation to be that high, and then I could paint in again where I did want it. So you can start to direct the viewer's eye using different adjustment layers. I'm just going to turn that back down. So it's not just the paintbrush you can use. We can also use the marquee select tools up here. So if I select an area and then add an adjustment layer, let's say we add a brightness and contrast, we can see that that layer mask has been brought in with that adjustment. So I make it brighter, we can see it's only affecting that area. And again, we can make adjustments to this layer. We could select an area here and paint it white, and it's going to be brighter. We can also use this marquee tool to draw around objects. So let's draw around this photo frame, and we want to change the levels on it. So we can start to individually add adjustment layers to certain objects, which is really handy. When you're using this marquee tool, you can draw, and then holding shift you'll be able to add to that selection. Using alt you'll be able to remove selections, and using this marquee tool you can add and remove sections as well. So get comfortable using the selection tools, but you don't always have to use, I'm just going to delete these two layers. You don't always have to use marquee tools like this. There is also a quick selection tool where you can click and draw, and it's going to select as best it can that section, which can be quite handy. But lucky for us, if we're using 3D packages, we can actually render out a wire color mask, or it's sometimes called a clown pass, and I'll bring that in now. And this is basically the watercolors are rendered out, so they're really bright and they can really help us with selecting objects. You may have noticed that I just kind of clicked and dragged to turn off all of these layers, so that's quite handy to know. And then using the magic wand tool, I can select all of these blues and then add a, let's say, a curves, and we want to add some contrast to that wall. Now we can see that that's only affecting that wall. So this is a really easy way to select only certain items. And I've selected this bed, but it's also selected the floor because they're the same color. So if we turned on contagious, it's only going to select the bed, and without it on, it's going to select the bed and the floor. So this is really handy if we want to just make updates to this bag, for example. Let's say we want to change the color balance and we want to make this bag brown, for example. We can really quickly do that using a watercolor selection. So what I'm doing is selecting our watercolor layer, selecting a color from it, then I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to add an adjustment layer on top, and I can change the exposure on it or whatever you see fit. But this is a great way to make selections and add masks and adjustment layers. As well as opacity over here, we also have blending modes, which you can find here. And you can click on this drop down and just press up and down on the keyboard, and you'll see what each one does. So this is quite good to find the appropriate blending mode that you're looking for. And certain render elements have certain blending modes which are appropriate. For example, our ambient occlusion pass, normally you'd put that onto a multiply. If I turn that on and off, you can see what that's doing. It's adding some depth to some of the detailed areas, but it's a bit too much, so we can really pull that opacity down, and it's just going to add a really subtle change. With a lot of adjustments, I recommend making them very subtle. You don't want to overdo it. It just starts to become really obvious. Another use of blending modes that I find useful is just selecting certain parts and color matching them. So for example, if we get sent a sample by a client, and for example, they want to make this headboard this color, what we can do is turn on our wire color and make the selection. And if you don't have your wire color, you could always try and use quick selection. If I press Ctrl D to deselect, we can select, with our layer selected, we can try and select this headboard. So you can see why we kind of want a wire color, but it's not impossible if you don't have one. So Ctrl D will deselect, and Ctrl Shift D will actually reselect. So I'm just going to select our headboard using our wire color. We don't actually have to have it visible either, so it's quite handy just to have it. Select that layer and magic wand it. And then what I'm going to do is add a solid color adjustment layer, and then using the eyedropper I can select a color from our sample and hit OK. Now if I change this blend mode to color, it's going to change the color of our headboard to this. Now it's not spot on, so I want to add another adjustment layer, and I'm going to hold Control and select our layer mask. So what it does is select our headboard again, and then I can select levels, and I'm just going to bring that down to make it a bit brighter, and I'm just looking at the sample and trying to match it up, and that looks good. And finally, let's add a vibrance, maybe pull the saturation down a little bit, add some more vibrance. You could add a color adjustment as well if you wanted, but yeah, you can keep playing with it. And that is a really quick way to match colors up and use the blending modes. Hi guys, and thanks for watching. I hope you found that video useful. This video is actually part of a larger course, so if you think you'd find that useful, then check out the link in the description. and feel free to like and subscribe.